Yeah, so consumerism is at once the triumph of utilitarianism and its tragedy, he says. Right? We know actually how immoral consumerism is and how morally twisted the greedy consumers have become. From a moral point of view, utilitarianism is a moral blind alley parallel to the parallel to the ethics of utilitarianism. A new phenomenon develops: the ethics of the machine. The ethics of the machine. The ethics has been hardly recognized, let alone formulated by scholars, historians, or philosophers. However, its influence has been profound, as it has been shaping and is still shaping generations of young people brought up in the Western ethos and educated in Western schools. Let us see the hidden matrix of this ethics and the way the chief imperatives of the ethics of the machine have been channeled. Take a few steps back in history. The metaphor of the world as a clock like mechanism has been pregnant with many consequences. Okay, and we understand that it was both the secular and religious understanding that contributed to that. Okay, as we discussed on yesterday's show, okay, there's no particular group to blame. Okay. Okay, I think religion is false, evolution is false. Okay, both of them have been corrupted. Those both systems are based on corrupt ideas. Okay, so we need nuanced views. We need multidisciplinary studies. Right? The people who are religious have to study philosophy. The people who are philosophical have to study history. Right? You got to get your hands dirty. Right? And of course, there's no departments in any universities. Right? They've all been compartmentalized. They're all run by experts that run particular fields of research. Right? So that's a dead end. So we need to come together and look at the sources and have adult education that's not mediated through experts and techniques that are controlled by the experts, right? But yeah, but I digress, right? We're talking about the ethics of the machine, right? And the world is a clock-like mechanism, and I thought that bared explaining. Among these consequences, moral ones have been overlooked. Let us see clearly how the very meaning of the mechanistic conception of the world was bound to create its own distinctive values in the long run. The protagonists of science and technology often repeat that both science and technology are value neutral. This may be true, but only in a trivial sense, as I shall presently demonstrate, he says. Okay, so yeah. So we'll read some of this too. So, later, right, he talks about how we came to view human knowledge and our relationship to knowledge, and right. So that is significant. Okay. Yeah, there was something I was just thinking about, but yeah, it just slipped my mind. Whoops. But yeah, let me yeah, I was thinking about like playing a video in relation to that, but it just like slipped my mind. But yeah. Yeah, but let me move to um let me move to Carlyle, right? To Thomas Carlyle. Right. Of course we got Carlyle and Ellul, right? And their thoughts are going to both magnify and explain some of those ideas there, right? So, in The Sign of the Times by Thomas Carlyle, 1795 to 1881, right? A Scottish philosopher, right? Okay. He says, sorry. were we required, to characterize this age of ours by any single epithet, we should be tempted to call it not a heroical, devotional, philosophical, or moral age, but above all, the mechanical age. It is the age of machinery in every outward and inward sense of the word. Okay, remember that in the 1800s, right, technology had already assumed, right, complex definitions, right? They already began to examine this thing called technology and see that it has both physical and non-physical constituents. Okay, and that's because of different ideas and conceptions within epistemology and the philosophy of mind. Okay, that some of which we were reflecting on during our various opening statements and the various shows that we've been doing. If you want to call them opening statements, they're more like a presentation of series of ideas and concepts. Yeah, it says it's the age of machinery in every outward and inward sense of that word, the age which, with its whole undivided might. Okay, so he's reflecting on the monistic quality of the technological milieu, right? The collective technical will that the machine civilization, right, seems to impose, right? And this is why man becomes the object of technique. Right? Because of this undivided might, this technical monism, technical will, and collective technical intent, right? The collective incubation of different forms of technique and their assimilation into the greater technical milieu, as Lula describes, right? So he's talking about how all the achievements of all knowledge are already headed in one direction, right? So knowledge has been catalyzed by technique. But yeah, he says nothing now is done. Wait, sorry, I skipped a line. He says for forwards with his whole undivided might, forwards teaches and practices the great art of adapting means to end. Adapting means to end. Okay, so he's already noticing the process of the complexification of means, right, and the massification of means. Nothing is now done directly or by hand. Right, so he's complaining about how all human effort is sort of sublimated or brought under the guise of this technical will. Right, so that as there's less things done by hand, there's also foggy somatic detachment or alienation, right, from those products of human creativity. All is by rule and calculated contrivance, right? So this reign of quantity. Okay. Okay, so this is also what Skolmowski was talking about, right? It's quality over quantity that is really referring to as morality above knowledge. Okay, it's a complex determination based on man's relationship to the notion of human knowledge, right? His relationship to the concept of God and the relationship to the concept of nature and technology, right? As one transhumanist explained, right? He said there's three people in the bidding of evolution. right? Man, nature, and technology. Right? They've taken God out of the picture, right? So he said that he thinks that man's on the side of nature, but nature's on the side of technology. Right? Or there's this idea of um you know ebbs and flows, right? Okay, we don't have to look at things in the notion of progress at all, right? Things evolve, right? They don't have to progress necessarily, right? Even though we see that Darwin and Hegel had a huge effect on the notion of things evolving in a linear fashion, right, towards a certain end, right? And of course, Hegel had the notion of teleology, but Darwin didn't, right? So you don't need it to develop this notion of progress. The notion of teleology in nature, right? Hegel and Alfred Russel Wallace kept it, right? But Darwin did not, right? Neither did the transhumanists. Anyways, um, for the simplest operation, some helps are accompaniment, some cunning abbreviation processes is in readiness. Our old modes of exertion are all discredited and thrown aside. On every hand, the living artisan is driven from his workshop to make room for the speedier inanimate one. The shuttle drops from the fingers of the weaver and falls into the iron fingers that ply it fast. The sailor furls his sails and lays down his oar and bids a strong, unwearied servant on vaporous wings bear him through the waters. Men have crossed oceans by steam. The Birmingham Fire King ship has visited the fabulous East and the genius of the Cape. Were there any poet um Camoans now to sing it, has again been alarmed, and with far stranger thunders than gammas. There is no end to machinery. Even the horse is stripped from his harness and finds a fleet fire horse invoked in his steed. Nay, we have an artist that hatches chickens by steam. The very brood hen is to be superseded. For all earthly and for some earthly purposes, we have machines and mechanic furtherances. For mincing our cabbages, for chasing us into magnetic sleep, we remove mountains and make seas our smooth highways. Nothing can resist us. We war with rude nature. And he puts nature with a capital N. And by our resistless engines come off always victorious and loaded with spoils. What wonderful accessions have thus been made and are still making to the physical power of mankind. How much better fed, clothed, lodged, and in all outward respects accommodated men now are or might be by a given quantity of labor is a grateful reflection which forces itself on everyone. Okay, so he's saying that for the great mass of men, right, a life of luxury is almost imposed on them. But it seems paradoxical, right? See, this is the paradox of progress and trying to create a perfect world for yourself, right? Right, is that some of the solutions are worse than the problems. Right, and the more complex solutions you create for a problem that didn't exist in the first place, right? Thinking cannot solve the problems that thinking has created. What changes too this addition of power is introducing into the social system? How wealth has more and more increased and at the same time gathered itself more into masses, strangely altering the old relations and increasing the distance between the rich and the poor. Will be a question for political economists and a much more complex and important one than they have yet engaged with. Believing these matters for the present, right? And this is the last paragraph I'll read here, right? And then I'll move on to Elul here. Right, it says, but leaving these matters for the present, let us observe how the mechanical genius of our time has diffused itself into quite other provinces. Not the external physical alone is now managed by machinery, but the internal and spiritual also. Here, too, nothing follows its spontaneous course. Nothing is left to be accompanied by old natural methods. Everything has its cunningly devised implements, its pre established apparatus. It is not done by hand, but by machinery. Thus, we have machines for education, Lancastrian machines, Hamiltonian machines, monitors, maps, and emblems. Instruction, that mysterious communing of wisdom with ignorance, is no longer an indefinable tentative process requiring a study of individual aptitudes and a perpetual variation of means and methods to attain the same end, but a secure, universal, straightforward business to be conducted in the gross by proper mechanism with such intellect as comes to hand. So he's reflecting on the total loss of skill and replacement of it by techniques and replacement of the measuring of this aptitude, right, for the methodology of experts. And of course, the great effect of this is the effect of is the effect produced by man's relationship to machinery. And of course, this is very early on that he's reflecting on this, right? In the 1800s. So he says, then we have religious machines of all imaginable varieties. The Bible Society, professing a far higher and heavenly structure, is found on inquiry to be altogether an earthly contrivance supported by collection of monies, by fomenting of vanities, by puffing intrigue and chicanery. A machine for converting the heathen. It is the same in all other departments. Has any man or any society of men a truth to speak, a piece of spiritual work to do, they can no wise proceed at once with a mere natural organs, but must first call a public meeting, appoint committees, issue prospectuses, eat a public dinner, in a word, construct or borrow machinery wherewith to speak it and to do it. Without machinery, they were hopeless, helpless, a colony of Hindu weavers squatting in the heart of Lancashire. Mark II, how every machine must have its moving power. In some of the great currents of society, every little sect among us, Unitarians, utilitarians. So he points to the same people that Skolimowski points out almost 100 years later. Anabaptists, free knowledges must have its periodical, its monthly or quarterly magazine, changing out like its windmill into the popular aura to grind meal for society. So there's some of the thoughts of Carlyle, and of course we're just beginning introducing that work. Sign of our times. We'll be looking into his thoughts on the mechanical age, as he put it. And of course, we have Ellul. That brings us to Ellul, right? And yeah.
TML, I'm gonna get out of here, man. I appreciate you letting me join in and listen. I always
Yeah, of course,
enjoy the reading. Yes, sir.
Yeah, thank you, my friend.
Yes, sir. Frank, you too. Peace out, Wolf. Take it easy.
Easy.
Yep. Bye.
Thanks, Hostile. Be well.
Yeah, we got quite some good presentations and some good participation with the panel here. Right. So yeah. That's what to do. You know,
How far are we into Carlisle so far? The sign of our times.
I just read like 3 paragraphs. So yeah, we got quite a bit of that going on. But yeah, we're moving to Ellul here. And yeah, Ellul has some interesting reflections. Okay, including this insane paragraph. Okay, he says the whole of man's life has become a function of economic technique. In its realization, technique itself has far transcended the timid hypothesis of the classical economists. Man knows himself to be more and more free, for technique has eliminated all natural forces, and in this way has given him the sense of being a master of his fate. The new man, being created before our very eyes, correctly tailored to enter into the artificial paradise, the detailed and necessary product of the means which he ordains for himself. That man is I, he says. So he's beginning the notion of man being the object of technique by pointing out that he himself is conditioned by living in a technological society. Yeah, blessings, Origin. I greatly appreciate your time. So yeah, that moves us to the next segment. Okay, as we're looking at the development of the ideal of the state and the utopian ideal, right? And I sort of laid a foundation for that. Right, we move to chapter 4. Right, 200 and page 229 in the Ellul book. I mean, 228 in the Ellul book. Right, on the chapter entitled "Technique and the State." Okay, and of course, the state is all about the development of private techniques. right? And of course, economics furnishes this domain, right? But the technical synthesis is about increased forms of centralization, planning, and norms, and all those rigmarole, right? So what ends up happening after time is that private techniques are assimilated, right? So technique begins as a private movement, right? This is the same as the ethnic or cultural movement, right? That symbols or cultural techniques, right, or human techniques integrate mechanical techniques into human society, right? Mechanical techniques are pretty much antisocial. Right? So this drive towards individualism and private decision making, right, as in capitalism and fascism, tends to limit the guise of technique because technique wants to bring individual decision making process into assimilation with the technical order. Right? It seeks to assimilate man. Right? So this conflict happens, right, between capitalism and fascism on the one end, as representing the individual, the force of the individual, or private techniques, right? And then the idea of the state or the collective ideal, right? And of course, you have socialism and technique on the other side, right? So there's sort of a push and pull between these two things, right? And it culminates in various developments, right? But what does it actually culminate in, right? Is the total, okay, sublimation of the state, right, to a technical synthesis, right, including the erasure of political decisions or the political decision making process, right? So here's an example of this, okay, and this is a little spoiler alert. Spoiler alert. Right on page 259 of this chapter, right? He gives a crazy, one of the craziest things I've read in this book, right? Okay, he says, the politician will find himself obliged to choose between the technician's solutions which is the only reasonable one, and other solutions, which he can indeed try out at his own peril, says Ellul, right? But which are not reasonable. At such a moment, the politician is gambling with responsibility, since there is a great chance of miscarriage if he adopts, technically deviant solutions. In fact, the politician no longer has any real choice. Decision follows automatically from the preparatory technical labors. Okay, Junk even claims that in the United States, on very advanced technical levels, unchallengeable decisions have already been made by electronic brains. Electronic brains. In the service of the National Bureau of Standards, for example, by the EAC, surnamed the Washington Oracle. The EAC is said to have been the machine which made the decision to recall General MacArthur after it had solved the equations containing all the strategic and economic variables in this plan. This example, which must be given with all possible reservations, is confirmed by the fact that American government has submitted to such computing devices a large number of economic problems that border on the political. Even admitting that we are not yet at this stage, we must recognize that every advance made in the techniques of inquiry, administration, and organization in itself reduces the power and the role of politics. Right? So the more
complex a political system becomes, right, and the more that political system is engendered, okay, or organized through the use of techniques, right, the less political decisions actually become necessary to the political process. And in this case, a machine made a decision. Right? They submitted their will to the calculations of a machine. And of course, as they chose to follow the decision made by the machine, right? It's important to note that the more and more political decisions are handed over to this type of process, the less and less, human beings are used to making their own choices, right? They will simply submit to, the process of technical inquiry. But yeah, so that's a little spoiler alert. Right, wild stuff. I never heard of that before, right? The Oracle. That kind of reminds me of the thing from the Matrix, right? Also a computer program in the movie.
Could you repeat the title of the work and the author? I'm not sure of his spelling. Ellul.
It's Ellul. Yeah, and then Jacques is Jacqueus, and then the work is called The Technological Society, and this is the Wilkinson translation. I'm pretty sure, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah, blessings and thank you.
oh yeah. So here we go. And yeah, give me a second. I need take a sip of water here. Okay. So Technique and the State, 228, page 228 of Ellul's Technological Society says the ponderous economic organization described in the preceding chapter requires the formation of a political technique. Nothing else could administer the decisions of economic policy. I'm not speaking here merely of economic planning to which the state alone can give a direction and a foundation. The whole of economic technique is confronted by the following dilemma. Either it receives from the state that sanction which alone can render it efficacious, or it must remain a mere abstraction, an offer without a taker. But who believes that such a noble edifice can remain an abstraction? There's in any case one agency which asks nothing better than to intervene, the state. But then the state itself will become technique. Okay. So this is those ideas of liberalism and universalism which created the state, right? Created a technical order, right? And the state becomes in line with that technical order. Okay, and disposes of those liberal and universal principles. So this is the movement he's going to chart in this chapter, as we've already seen within the ideological format of the development of the concepts in this book, right? As I talked about earlier, right? Technique integrated the machine into human society, right? The machine itself is antisocial, right? It's cultural and symbolic forms of technique that then create a reliance on technical forms, right? And this is brought forward through various forms of cultural assimilation, right? First through theological forms, and then through the political forms themselves, which are a product of liberalism in the scientific worldview, and then the sublimation of those ideas and concepts under the technical order. And of course, we talk about like sort of like 4 phases of this, right? From mythos to logos. Okay, from basically art to philosophy to religion to science. Right? Mythos, logos, theos, mechanos. As we've been charting that out, right? Yeah, peace, Frank. Blessings. The state's encounter with technique, ancient techniques. Right, so Lowell accounts ancient techniques, right? In this section, he says the state has always exploited techniques to a greater or lesser degree. This is not new, but the techniques of the state corresponding to the limited functions of the state were hitherto encountered only in limited domains. Let us consider briefly the techniques employed by the state on the eve of the French Revolution. And there was, first of all, a military technique. This technique represented even then a very advanced system. It undergone a great development in many respects, and it involved a loosening of the traditional rigidities. Okay, so notice that, right? Okay, so this loosening of traditional rigidities. Okay, he's talking about the sublimation of cultural forms under technical forms, right? Also talked about by Mumford. There had been much improvement, for example, in the art of fortification and above all in tactics. Logistics, recruitment, and military hospitals had all experienced improvement. In my memoir, Sur la Recruitment, I have shown that the study of Le Tellier and Louvois on this subject fails because they confuse civil and military administration. In logistics and related fields, France had experienced the highest development. Tactics made an extraordinary leap forward to the 18th century and became a technique of extreme precision under Frederick the Great. According to Frederick's conception, battles were to be won through the execution of certain movements with a minimum of combat and with the minimal use of soldiers. Okay, this probably greatly influenced those thinkers that conducted guerrilla warfare, like George Washington, for example, right? All right, Frank's back. Blessings. Okay. So Frederick the Great, right? And we got to move on here in a minute to the Shang Tzu, but I'm going to read a couple more paragraphs here to end this discussion about various topics, right? About the ethics of the machine, the mechanical age and the loss of human skill, okay, and the sublimation of the state to technique and the combination of the state with technique in Elul that we're reading right now, right? Basically, culminating in the rise of the technological society whose key feature is that man becomes the object of technique. This happens first with the combination of economics and technology, right? Economic systems and technology, right? And then moves when the state starts to take certain ideas of economic planning under its own guise and uses certain methods of gathering information through propaganda and advertising and administrative capacity and organizational capacities. Right? And he's talking about like during the French Revolution, right? The idea of strategy and military tactics, right? The ideas of Frederick the Great, right? The ideas of military hospitals and this greatly the ideas of weaponry, okay, the ideas of naval command and the ability to conduct naval campaigns, right? Okay, so all of these techniques, right, created a new era of warfare, right? So to speak. So this is what he's talking about, right? According to Frederick's conception, battles were to be won through execution of certain movements. With a minimum of combat with minimal use of soldiers, skill and position, movement would necessarily lead to the enemy to surrender. According to Guglielmo Ferrero, economy of means and an almost guaranteed success were characteristic of this technique, already far advanced. The French Revolution, however, brought about a decisive regression in tactical technique through its introduction of popular armies and mass levies of soldiers. With the revolution, tactics sank little by little into obscurity. Military strategy and its related services developed and gave rise to innumerable techniques, but tactical science remained inert. Thus, in modern wars, enormous masses of human and material means are employed, and more often than not, are sacrificed to a dubious outcome. To offset this, medical and supply services have at their disposal a vast apparatus. that operates with great efficiency as a result of technical improvements. The American Army in 1944, and the most remarkable example of this, epidemics, for instance, hitherto the universal accompaniment of war claimed no victims. In the last two wars, with the exception of the year 1918 to 1919, military techniques taken as a whole and in its various forms represents a very old technique, which at the present is executed entirely by the state and devised by its employees. A financial technique corresponding to the financial functions had likewise evolved by the time of the Revolution and was already of great age and comparatively highly developed. Okay, so these military and economic techniques, as you can imagine, right, which are the vehicles of spreading political techniques, right, as we've seen, right? And also great vehicles of international trade, right, by the whole notion of colonialism, right? So you can already see that, okay, during this time, right, we had already seen this for like, okay, 200 years. Okay, we have 200 years of reflection on Frederick the Great and, colonialism and all these great inventions and all that stuff, right? The printing press. Right, so these military and medical techniques were a necessary consequence of these developments, right? So, yeah. So let's move to some music and move to the Shangzhou. Right, and yeah, we're going to switch it up a little bit. A little bit of a different topic. Okay. And then we'll move to the discussions of Uncle Teddy. Okay, well, we were reflecting on his notion of the development of human history, and he's kind of taking a radical look at man's development and sort of drawing a dialectic between man's development and the technological progress accelerating, and how our adaptation to nature is being imposed on by these technical forms at an increasingly accelerating rate, right? To which, if technology is developing and our ability to adapt to the changes in human society, right, are retarding right our aspect of finding the greatest type of human flourishing that is available. Okay, so he's re-examining the rate of technological progress and our adaptation to those technical means. Okay, so we're doing that to analyze the evolutionary view of the transhumanists, right, who want to accelerate evolutionary and technological progress. And he's sort of giving a few arguments about that, right? Anyways, so we reflected on that. Tomorrow we'll be continuing that discussion. I mean, we reflected on that yesterday, and we'll be continuing that discussion today. And yeah. So yeah,
we're gonna move on to the Shangzhou here, but yeah, blessings. I greatly appreciate you guys' participation in the stream. And of course, we're taking a musical interlude. We'll be back in a little bit. Blessings, guys.
Nights are the same. In the beginning and in the end, yeah. Should be looking a whole lot like the same nowadays, don't it? Yeah. Drunken monks, baby. Gotta hit him over the fucking head. Okay. Once more. Check me out. The absolute. Yeah. Yeah. Mars, the kid. Mars, man. Now peep me out for a second, Southwest, baby. Look, Lord, have forgiveness on my physical. From the dawn of time, the pagan ritual, the Vegas of anguish, pitiful language, mystical pain is painted as literal. You know the name of the game? Got a lock like Stash Box or an interview. I'll spend 1,000 days in the sun. Tonight's 1,001. A Wild West revolver like I'm Samuelson. Blam the gun, scramming sums. I sold your wallet to bums. And slow burn like asbestos is in your lungs. Direct disciple of Billy, the kid with rifles. I'm peeling your wicked rifle. Chameleon kids will spite you. You feel the haiku reptilian skin and light blue-eyed Brazilian women is chilling with nice boobs. I kill your men with my tunes and laying tombs. The Alpha and Omega on display at the moon, huh? And I'm the greatest of goons, just like my city playing with fumes of a crime-long can to shake the room. Yeah, I'm just saying I hate to do work that others claim they made and then they can take the silver spoon. Look, so what's the frontin' in your mouth? You ain't from the south, we send them into the dungeon to face the doom. Yeah, these other cashes ain't the dudes, and I couldn't blame them for being dick catchers cause they mothers womb. It's how they was raised, was rather how they was let down.